Hey, this is Joe Gilder from Presonus. I want to talk to you today about mixing. I've got a 5-step mix guide that I want to share with you today, and in subsequent videos go into it a little more in depth. If you followed me over at Home Studio Corner, I've been talking about these 5 steps for a while now, and the actual steps themselves have evolved over time as I've thought more and more about my mixing process. So is it steps for the sake of steps? No, it's actually having mixed hundreds of songs over the years, my own music for clients, music for different mixing programs I've been a part of. I've noticed that there are some familiar trends that happen every time I mix a song, whether it's a guitar and a vocal or a huge song with 70 plus tracks. I follow a similar process, and I've developed that process over the years of just a lot of trial and error, a lot of spinning my wheels, a lot of never knowing when the mix is done, and I've gotten to a point where I feel really confident if I sit down at this computer with a set of tracks I've never heard before, within a couple of hours I'm going to be close to finished, and within a few more hours after that it's going to be done. And I do that by following this process. Now, feel free to take any or all of these steps and use them in your process for yourself, or modify them to something that makes sense for you. But I'm going to share these with you. Give them a shot, see if they work for you, and I bet you'll find you'll be getting better mixes in less time the more you practice this. Before we dive into what the steps are, because that's important, I want to talk about what mixing is. In my mind, when I think about mixing, the number one word that pops into my brain is balance. Now, you might be rolling your eyes thinking that's the most obvious statement of the decade. Well, fine. But let me talk to you a little bit more about that. Balance isn't just volume. It is that, but it's so much more. So there's a couple different ways to think about balance. The first is obviously volume. We're talking about we've got a bunch of different tracks that have a bunch of different faders, and we're going to move those faders up and down to balance them. If we've got a guitar track and a vocal track, we want to make sure that the guitar track's not too loud and that the vocal track's not too loud, that they are balanced together. That's the first thing, volume balance. The other type of balance we can talk about is stereo balance. So when you're mixing a song, you can pan something up the middle, you can pan it to the left, you can pan it to the right. Where do you put those things? How do you balance those things? If you pan everything up the middle, it's going to be a fairly mono mix. Maybe that's cool for the given song you're working on, or maybe that feels too narrow and you want to spread things out and make it feel wider and take advantage of the stereo spectrum. Or let's say you take a track and you move it to the left. Well, now the mix is left heavy. What are you going to move to the right to create a balance? It's almost like a scale. If I put one guitar over here and it's a main guitar part, probably need something to come in over here to balance those out, or the mix is going to feel left heavy. That's the second type of balance. Third type of balance is frequency balance. So if we think about the EQ spectrum of your mix, you've got lows, low mids, and highs. Every track in your session is going to have some elements in almost all of those ranges. We want to make sure that by the end of the mix, we're hearing all of those in a balanced way. We don't want too much low mids, or people will say our mix is muddy. We don't want too much high mids, or people will say our mix is harsh. We don't want to have no lows, or people will say our mix is lacking any thickness or warmth. There's all these words that we use, but we're really just talking about frequencies. Now, I'm not talking about pulling up some sort of a frequency spectrum analyzer and making it look a certain way. That sounds appealing, and I have people ask me all the time, I pull up this thing and I look at the EQ curve, and then I try to match the EQ curve of my mix to the EQ curve of this professional mix. It's not going to work. You can match those curves and have it sound terrible. What you want to do is achieve a similar balance. That's why reference tracks are so popular. It's not that I'm going to try to make my mix sound exactly like that Foo Fighters mix. It's just I want to make sure that I don't have any frequencies that are way out of balance with everything else that make my mix stand out amongst the others. We want to have some level of familiarity when I'm shuffling through songs on my phone. It goes from one of my songs to a popular, major label release. I don't want there to be huge differences where the major label release has all this warm low end and mine doesn't. That's the kind of frequency balance we're talking about. And even within, we're going to dive in over the next several videos, we're going to dive into each step of this process. And you're going to hear me talk about balance a lot, but I wanted to hit that right up front because to me that is what we do. I read somewhere or heard that back in the day, like in the Beatles era of recording, they called the audio engineers balance engineers. They were called balance engineers, partly because there wasn't a whole lot of equipment or processing they could do to the audio. It was mostly, here comes the audio, let's make sure that level's right, and there it goes, out to the mono, recorder over there, because they did a lot of things live in the studio. Performed it over here, mixed it down, went to tape, done. Really fun. But now we have a lot more options, we have a lot more capabilities, but the game is the same. It's a game of balance. Okay, so let's shift gears. I'm going to talk briefly about the 5 steps of this 5-step mix process, and then I'll do one video for each of the steps moving forward to really dive in and explain it a little more. But here's your overview. Step 1, setup. That is the dumbest, most boring step of the whole process, but it's important. How I set up my sessions helps me in a number of ways. One, it helps me identify what's there. If someone sends me tracks, and I'm setting up my session, the process that I use for setup helps me make sure I don't miss important tracks as I'm bringing them in. It also helps me mix faster. I have a certain color scheme that I use, and I always know that the drums are blue and they're over here, and the bass is red and it's over here, and I can easily navigate and find things so that I'm not sitting there spinning my wheels, constantly searching for that shaker track and not knowing what color it is and where it is in the session. So there's a lot that goes into setup that's you can probably file under boring, but necessary. If you have an assistant, I wish we all had an assistant, this is the kind of work that that person would do, then you would come in for the next step. Okay, step 2 is the static mix. This is the step that so many people want to skip. You want to get your tracks in, do your thing, and then start slapping plugins everywhere. And of course, Studio One makes it even easier because you can just drag and drop stuff. That's a wonderful feature, but
with great power comes great responsibility.
You can't just start throwing a bunch of plugins into this situation and expect things to get better if you haven't first gotten a good balance. See, there's that word. I told you, you're going to be sick of the word balance by the end of this. When I talk about a static mix, I'm talking about only touching the faders and the panners and spending a good amount of time just getting the balance right without touching a single EQ, compressor, reverb, anything. Just taking the raw tracks and getting them balanced amongst themselves. Then you can move on and start adding all your favorite plugins. I promise, if you don't do this as a part of your mixing process, you will find your mixes improving instantly by just incorporating this step. Just between setting up your mix and inserting a plugin, add 20-30 minutes of just static mix and just see what happens. It sounds dumb, but it makes a huge difference. Okay, on to step 3. Step 3 this is new for kind of the way I've done these steps. Fix the big problems in the mix. As you're doing your static mix in step 2, you're going to listen and hear obvious problems in the mix. Oh, that vocal is way too dynamic. I hear it way too loudly on certain words, and then I don't hear it at all on others. Maybe we need to go fix that. Or that bass guitar has far too much low mids. It just sounds muddy, and it's not. All I hear is just this big woofiness. Probably need to fix that. Oh, that guitar is too muddy. Oh, that guitar is too bright. Oh, those keyboards are too muffled. Those are kind of the things that we're going to hear as we're doing that static mix. So during the static mix, we're not allowed to touch those things, but we can hear and identify those and kind of file those away for step 3. Step 3 is when we go to fix some of those issues. I used to tell people to jump straight to top-down mixing, which is the next step, but that doesn't work super well if there are some major problems in the tracks themselves. I'll explain that in a second in more detail in the future video. All right, so once you've addressed the big problems, the kind of major, the snare drum's ringing way too loud, and you fix those things, the things that have been raising their hand saying, hey, I'm a problem, come fix me, then it's time to move on to what I call top-down mixing, or I've called it backwards mixing before. And this is the idea of having all your tracks routed to different buses. A bus for your drums, where all your drums come through here. A bus for your bass tracks, if there's more than one. A bus for your electric guitars, acoustic guitars, synths, keyboards, all those things. And start by just taking those handful of 6 to 9 buses and just mix on those first. So you're doing EQ and compression on just those channels and seeing how far you can get without touching the individual pieces of the kit. This is where drum bus compression comes in. This is where you start EQing your entire drum kit. And you'll be surprised how good you can make things sound with a single EQ and a single compressor on a bus, as opposed to zooming in and putting EQs and compressors on every single channel of your drums, for example. Once you've done the top-down part, where you've got a little bit of processing on all the buses, then you can zoom in and address some of the issues that need to be addressed. So maybe the snare drum needs a little bit of extra EQ, maybe it needs a little bit of compression as well. You can do all that, but after you've done that previous step of doing some processing on the buses themselves. What you'll find is you might get a lot closer to finishing your mixes by just doing the top-down portion, and maybe there'll be some mixes. I've done this before. I've had some mixes where I don't have any plugins on the drums at all because A, the drums sounded good, and B, I was able to get the sound that I wanted with just EQ and compression on the entire drum kit instead of the individual components. All right, step 5, and this is my nerdiest but most fun one, is what I call the to-do list method for knowing when your mix is finished. So it's literally listening down and making a list of problems in the mix and then using that list to go back and finish. It sounds simple, but there's a couple of like key points to it that you have to keep in mind or you won't get it right. We'll talk about that in a future video, but this is kind of the place where when you're getting to that point where you're like, I'm just not sure if my mix is finished. I think I'm there. How do I know? This is how you know. Step 5 is a process you'll repeat over and over and over until your to-do list is empty, and then you say, I guess I'm done. And now your mix is finished. All right, thanks so much for watching this. Hopefully this gave you an idea of what to expect in the next several videos. We're going to do a video for each of these steps and really spell it out for you. So if you have any questions, leave them below, and I'll be sure to incorporate those into my answer, or I'll just answer you directly in the comments. Again, I'm Joe from Presonus. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.